Hello and welcome to Aspects of Writing. I'm your host, James Kelly. My co-host for today's show is Joyce K. Gatchenberger, and our guest is Rena Winters. And the topic of the show is creative writing, finding your purpose and passion. And Joyce, I'm going to let you introduce yourself first, and then we're going to talk to Rena a little bit.
Certainly. Thank you very much. Glad to be here today. My name is Joyce K. Gatchenberger. I have authored a couple of books. My first one is Lines of Listening, which is an expose of child abuse and marital betrayal. It is nonfiction. The next one is Generations Intertwine, which is fiction, a follow-up to the first book. And I'm currently working on my next book, which will be out soon.
All right. And our guest is Rena Winters. She is the author of 2 books, Smurfs, The Inside Story of the Little Blue Characters, and Holy Cause, Target America. Rena is a creative writing instructor at CSN here in Las Vegas. Rena, please tell us a little bit more about your past.
Well, I will be happy to do that, and thank you for having me today. First of all, I am the author of 4 books. I have 4 books.
Okay.
The 4th one's coming out shortly. I interned in Los Angeles at Universal and wanted to be in entertainment, and they said behind the scenes in production somewhere. So I used to watch the writers, and they seemed like they had a good life. They were making good money and scheduled their own time. And one day the head writer was very angry. Somebody didn't show up to write a particular scene for one of the shows at Universal. And being a brash young kid, I spoke up and said, I'll write it. I'll put it on your desk in the morning. And he kind of looked at me, but he didn't say no. So I went ahead and put it on his desk. And they used part of it in one of the show's sequences. A couple weeks later, I was called to Human Resources, and I thought, I'm going to get fired. I'm too pushy. And they said, you've been transferred to the writer's pool. So Monday morning, I started in the writer's pool at Universal. I was the only woman there, and I was the only young person there, and
Wow.
I was scared to death. But I had wonderful help from some wonderful mentors and went on to write several shows and received some awards. And from there, I wrote short stories and books, and I'm where I am today.
All right. And we're going to talk a little bit about your career because it actually is detailed pretty much in your book about Smurfs. Mm-hmm. So we'll get into that in a minute. We're going to be talking about creative writing, which is what you teach now.
That's correct.
And finding your purpose and passion, which I know you know all about. So I would like to go ahead and start out. First of all, where can we find your books? Where are they available?
My books they're available on Amazon. They're also available through my email, which is winters.rena@yahoo.com. And you contact me and I'll be sure you get a copy of the book.
Okay. All right. So are you working on anything else right now?
I am currently working on the 4th novel. Is gone to the publisher. It is a crime story. I have discovered that the last 2 books being crime stories seem to have more success than memoirs and other types of stories. So I've concentrated more on writing mysteries.
Okay. And Joyce, do you have any questions for her?
I do. When you say you were brash in approaching the movie theaters, or not theaters, the movie writers and the whole Universal setup, what was that like? How do you feel like, since you were, as you say, the only woman and very young, what made you jump in and say, I can do this? Because when you find your passion, you kind of have maybe a false sense of security or humor or anxiety or all of that rolled into one?
Well, I had an excellent education. I had a master's degree in communications, and I desperately wanted to be in the entertainment industry. And as I looked around, I saw the production jobs and I saw the writing, and I thought, I can write, I can do this. Because I had always kept like a diary or a journal all the time through high school, and I thought, I know I can write. So that's what started it. And I guess I was brash and young and the world was my oyster. I thought there's no reason why I can't. It was later I learned no, and things became difficult sometimes. But I proceeded to pursue it, and I've always been writing. I've written short stories and documentaries and screenplays and all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
So the passion's always been there then?
I think so.
Sounds
I
like
think
it.
it was always
Sounds like
there.
it, yes.
Well, was there anything in your childhood that maybe stirred that passion for writing?
I was an only child. I spent a lot of time alone, so I read a lot as a child. And I think that helped develop a creative mindset. You know, I had
probably.
imaginary characters in my
Yes,
mind.
yes.
And I think that was part of it.
Okay. Can you give us a little background on the two most recent books, I guess? Well, the Smurf book, I know everyone would probably be interested in. Can you give us a little background on that book?
Well, the Smurf book is basically a memoir of the years that I worked with the company that produced the animated Smurf series in Hollywood. I wrote it primarily when I saw that they were coming out with the movies. 3 years ago, I read that they were coming out with the first Smurf movie. And I thought, maybe people would like to hear the inside story of the animation industry. And I wrote it particularly because I'm a strong believer in subliminal programming of young children's minds. And I saw through animation how they were doing this continually. And I think it's a scary process, and I think parents and grandparents really need to be aware of that the animated characters are not always such innocent little characters. Sometimes they have an agenda.
A subliminal message.
Yes.
Can I ask you why you think that was a scary process? I know when you're talking about animation, it's usually the Saturday morning cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you say scary?
Because I think parents that are busy working all week tend to set their kids in front of the television on Saturday morning and say, oh, watch the cartoons. But the cartoons are not innocent. They're full of messages that maybe you don't want your young child to know. Could be violence. It could be terrorism. It could be subliminal socialism. It could be almost anything. Watch the shows with your children. Know what they're watching, what they're ingesting, because their very young minds are absorbent sponges. And you really don't want them to be getting something that you as the parent really don't believe in.
So that's what your book is about.
That's right.
Yeah. There was a comparison with communism with the Smurfs when it comes to everyone wearing, I think it was, or actually everyone being blue. That was one.
Exactly.
And then instead of being a monetary thing when it comes to growing the food and selling it, they didn't sell it. Everyone got an equal share.
Right. And if you had a particular job, if you were a carpenter, you were a carpenter for life. If you were a banker, you were a banker for life.
I see.
They also lived in a commune, which some people took offense of.
Yeah. And then I noticed, when I was reading in the book, there was also a comparison with the KKK,
Yes.
with everyone wearing the white hat or cap,
Yeah.
except for the main character who wore a red one.
Exactly.
And that was the comparison with the KKK.
And the protagonist was Jewish Gargamel, and some people found that offensive also.
Did they try to hide the fact that they were giving this subliminal message? Did they
I don't
want
think
you to
so.
write in a way that it said, well, let's make this an animation and let's not let the public in general let the message that is underlying be known?
Well, it was designed primarily to make money, which it was one of the most successful animated series of all times. But they used the word Smurf like 20 times in 24 minutes. So young children, that word became programmed in their mind. Also, when they saw the images on cereal boxes or on cookies or on glasses, that's what they wanted. And parents then would buy it for them. So the marketing and merchandising became a huge part of the Smurfs.
But weren't the two writers responsible? One who was responsible for like influencing with the KKK situation. Wasn't there a connection there?
The original author was named Peo, and he definitely was a Nazi, and he put those thoughts into the scripts. Now, the scripts came from Belgium, and then they were translated into English, and the animation was done at Hanna-Barbera. But nobody really paid much attention to the translations until it was called to our attention after the shows were airing.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting story that you tell in the book about your trip to Belgium. Can you talk about that? Because that was something that was supposed to be a secret, and you ran into someone that was familiar while you were there.
Several things happened when I went on my first trip to Brussels. Number one, I had not been in Brussels before, and the company headquarters brought me there primarily to talk with me because of things that were happening in the LA market. And so it was done kind of hush hush, and I was there. The first thing that happened was I stayed at a hotel, and I checked in very late at night, and in the morning I got up and showered, and they had a bathrobe, and I put on the bathrobe, and here was the initials RW. And I thought, whoa, how nice, they have my initials on the robe.
Oh, dear.
When I went down to breakfast, I found out it was the Royal Windsor Hotel. It had nothing to do with me. And it kind of was interesting because they talked with me about what was happening in the LA market. And when I returned from that meeting, I thought I would possibly be laid off. And instead, they got rid of the gentleman that was the head of the company, and they offered me executive vice president.
Ooh.
Now, with that story, that was interesting because you were really like a trailblazer in the sense that you were a woman,
Yeah.
and you were taking on a position that was normally a man's.
Exactly.
And I remember you said you sat down with was you and the two bosses, and they wanted to determine what to pay you. So yeah,
Oh, that must
Tell
be an
that
interesting story. I
That-
can't wait to hear
That's
that.
a very interesting story. It's never happened to me but once in my life. We were sitting at a lunch, and they were talking about hiring me for this position, and they began to talk about salary, and they said, look, instead of talking out loud about salary, why don't we each write on a piece of paper what we feel this job is worth? And then we'll try to negotiate something similar. So we each put down on the back of a business card what we thought the job should pay. When they turned the cards over, all three were identical, which
yeah.
was phenomenal.
And I hope they valued your ability.
Well, what I found
Yes,
interesting
good,
about that is
good.
because they were men in Hollywood at that time, they were obviously having to think about a salary that would be conducive with what they think that you should be paid.
Exactly.
And you normally are used to paying men.
Yes.
You, on the other hand, are thinking, I need to get paid what's fair for me as a woman, regardless of whether it's a man's world or not.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting that they felt you should be paid what you thought you should be paid.
I found it very interesting, too. I knew that they weren't going to pay the top amount that they were paying men for that position. So I did set the number down some, but I felt that it was a big responsibility. It proved to be. I was 3 weeks out of every month in LA and 1 week in Brussels, flying back and forth. There was very little sleep, very little time to myself. It really was an experience of giving up your life for the company, basically. And I'm not sorry I did it, but it was a tremendous commitment.
Well, one of the stories I remember reading, too, was when you went to, I think it was Brussels, you had to call in sick. They wanted you to call in sick. They did not want the executives to know that they were bringing you. They already had your airline ticket and everything ready for you to go.
Exactly.
And you felt uncomfortable making that call.
I did. They said, don't tell them where you're going. Just call in sick that you won't be at work this week. And I said, nobody's going to buy that. And they said, no, just call in and tell them that you're sick and that you probably will be back, but you'll be back the following Monday. And they had already all the arrangements made for me to fly to Brussels to talk with me at length.
And who was it you ran into that I think you said you ran into one of the executives from the show there? And did you ever wonder why he was there as well?
I did.
And that it was never brought up. You never spoke about it.
No, they never said anything about it. They never said why he was there. I saw him there. He saw me. And I'm sure he
Not
was
at
shocked.
the same meeting, by the way.
No, I'm sure he was shocked to even see me there. But we never discussed it. And by the time I returned to Los Angeles, he was no longer with the company.
Oh.
No longer there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting
Yeah.
story in itself.
It is.
Yeah.
It
You know.
is.
So you had quite an interesting career in Hollywood. Let's just say that.
I love the Hollywood years. Yes, I did.
One of
Very
the things I found interesting, and I've heard of it before, but I didn't realize it was as prominent as what you had mentioned in the book, in that when you left, you had to sign a non-compete clause. And that kept you out of the business for how many years?
It kept me out for 1 year, but
But-
that's a long time in the industry.
And then when we get older, and it's certainly that way in Hollywood, 1 year can make a big difference.
Absolutely. 1 year out of the business can be a lifetime, really.
Yeah.
And at that point, we kind of decided, both my husband and I, to make the move to Las Vegas. And then he started teaching at CSN, and later I started teaching there. And we both went on to write books, and so our life changed a little. But we had a lot of wonderful years in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Sounds like it.
And it was really interesting because we don't think that this is still currently going on. And I think you and I spoke about a gentleman that I knew that was in Hollywood for 40 years. And all of a sudden he wakes up one day and he's too old for them. And it didn't matter that he had been on a hit show that had been on for like 6 or 7 years, literally directed every episode except 8, I think. And then various other television shows he directed. But you reach a certain point to where you're no longer of value.
And I think that's even more true with women. I think they tend to look
Probably
at women and they look for young women. And once you reach 40 or so, they figure you're through. You're done.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about the writing part of it. Is it different in the type of writing that you do for scripts or TV shows or movies that you would do maybe for a book?
Absolutely, because
how is that different?
Usually you're committed to write a certain thing. You're writing a certain particular scene, you're writing a certain subject matter, and that is given to you, and you may have to go and research it in order to do it. Where when you're writing your own projects, yes, you do research, but more often it's things that are close to your heart that you're passionate about when you write for yourself.
Do they have words or sentences that they want you to put in to guide the scene a certain way, or do they give you, as they say, carte blanche?
The other part of it is not so much that they direct you what to write, but rather what you cannot write for television specifically. Movies, you have a lot of latitude. You can write anything. But television still comes into the home and it appeals to families. And so there are certain lines, certain words, certain subjects that are considered not acceptable. And so they pretty much tell you what you can't write about.
Well, and also in writing from script as opposed to books, there is a difference in the writing style as well, because a script is limited to a X amount of pages, 90 to 120 for a motion picture. Whereas a novel, you can write 200, 300, 400 pages or more.
Exactly.
That's true.
So you really have to be concise with what you're trying to put on paper when it comes to a script, and you're not as descriptive with the setting or the scene.
That's correct.
Or even the characters sometimes, which to me, I find that interesting.
You have to remember that when you're writing a script, you're writing for a visual medium, whether it's television or motion pictures.
Good point.
And the visual is very often carrying the story, and the lines are part of it. So it's more direct, it's more to the point, it's faster paced, faster moving, because the audience is also seeing the visual happening.
Yeah, I always find that interesting. And I don't understand what that's going about. But anyway, what I find interesting in writing from script to novel as well, a lot of people say, well, it's so much easier to write a novel than it is to write a script. Then I've had other people who say it's a lot easier to write a script as opposed to a novel. I actually think it's easier to write a script. What is your take on that? I'm just curious.
I would say that you're one of the few. It's more difficult to write a script because you have to do it in less words and it has to move along very quickly. And people tend to forget, like I said, that there's a visual medium happening also at the same time. So writing a book, you can sit and write and be descriptive and go on, but with a script, you can't do that.
I know, but you know what I find interesting is I oftentimes, the very first thing I ever wrote, I wrote it as a script. And then someone said, in order to get recognition for what you're doing, you need to put it out as a book. And that will hopefully garner attention to the script. So I took the script and I started writing it into a book format or a novel format. And I found that easy for me to write it as a novel because I already had the outline. I had laid it out already.
Yeah.
The only thing I didn't have was the descriptions or the specific place or surroundings. Obviously, you can create more characters when you do a book as well. You can add in more characters. But that's why I found it easier to go from script to novel. Because to me, if you're writing a novel and then you take that and put it back in script format, now you have to reduce it. You have to eliminate.
Absolutely.
So that's why I always found script writing easier.
It's kind of interesting because I think most people find it the other way around. It's easier to write a novel than it is to write a script. However, in order to sell scripts, especially for motion pictures, if you have a novel that backs it up and the novel is mildly successful, you have a good chance of selling the script.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And I was looking at the creative part of writing, and I'm wondering if when you were in LA, if they brought you into a large room and they showed you a storyboard and they said, this is what the movie or the animation is about. This is what we already have planned out. What we want you to do is write a script to match this particular picture or this particular scene. How did you meld the two together with your writing?
Usually I'd go home with what they had given me, the parameters, and try to visualize where the ending was going to be. And then I would sit down and try to write whatever scene it is, knowing that it was leading to a particular type of ending.
So maybe you had to be more creative in a restrictive little box because maybe you had less words and you were kind of confined in a specific area to describe that.
I think it gives you discipline. Number one, you're disciplined to have to produce something within a certain amount of time, especially for television. Shows run on time and they're scheduled, and you have to produce whatever you're doing within a certain amount of days. You can't sit on it and say, I'll do it later. That's one. So you become more disciplined. And I think that you learn to write perhaps more direct. And at least for me, that was my way of doing it. I tried to be more direct in what I was sharing.
Did you have the final say with what was approved? And
not
what
always.
wasn't?
No, not always. Sometimes on some of my stories, yes, but not always. Sometimes there was a head writer that would delete this or that, or sometimes the producer would say, no, that's not really what we want to do. Go back and redo it. So that happens.
Was there ever a time where you were writing on the moment or in the moment?
Yes, especially on movies.
Yeah.
You'll be on the set and they'll be changing it.
Yeah.
The director suddenly doesn't like the scene. The actor, who is a major big name actor, doesn't like the wording. Now you're sitting down, writing it, rewriting it to give it to them almost instantly.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. When it comes to, you had just mentioned that you often had an ending and worked toward that. Do you still write that way?
I outline my books, but not a big major outline like a lot of authors do. I have the beginning, the middle, and the end in mind when I sit down to write a book. And I know where it's going to end. I know what the middle should encompass, and I have the beginning. And that's how I write. Now, I know some authors actually outline every chapter. I don't do that.
So it's a difference between a plotter and a prancer, as they say. A plotter being somebody who may outline every single scene or chapter, and the prancer being like, well, let me see what the characters are doing today.
And that's what I was going to say. You know, a lot of us write letting the characters. I know Joyce writes based on fact, a lot of hers, so it's a little more difficult because she has really an outline, a chronological outline as to what you're writing.
I've realized I'm half and half plotter, half prancer. So I'm a hybrid, I
Plotter
guess.
prancer.
Yeah, plotter prancer, yes.
I always let my characters, I don't know that I've ever written anything of my own personal that wasn't directed by the characters. I always let them lead me to something. If I write based on a dream, which I do a lot, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, the dream. So I do have an outline already in mind. But if I'm just creating something off my mind based on something I have seen or someone said something that, you know, jarred something in me to write it, then I just let the characters guide me. They kind of like create the story for me.
I'm curious, from both of you, where do you write? Do you write at the same place all the time?
No.
Do you write at the same time?
Joyce is probably more disciplined than I am.
I make sure I write every day, first of all. I have to write every day at least a block of time. And I have a section of my house set up for that. I recently decided that I needed to be more isolated because I get easily distracted with things that are going on. So I write in the morning, and I write at a block of time, and I write every day.
Good. Because that's what I tell my students is, number one, you have to be comfortable in your setting, your chair, wherever it is, the desk. Be comfortable in your clothing so that you're not restricted. And try to write at the same time every day. I really believe that it triggers creativity. If you set a certain time that you're going to sit and write every day. I write very early morning.
Oh.
I get up, I get my coffee with my robe, and I go sit at my desk. And the next thing that happens is a cat jumps on the desk and has 5 minutes of attention. Then she lays down, and I start to write. But I like to write early, before the phones ring, before the day starts, before there's interruptions.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's interesting because, like, I have different modes of writing. If I've already outlined something and I've pieced together, sentences I've written on the back of a napkin or whatever, and I want to formulate it, I will actually go to a restaurant or someplace where it's noisy, and I'll get a booth, and I'll let them know I'm going to be here for a couple hours. I always make sure and I'm generous with my tip. But, I want to let them know I'm going to be taking up this booth for a couple hours and I'm going to be writing. And there's something about that noise that puts me in a zone where I can be more creative. If I'm sitting in a still, like if I was sitting in this office and it's dead quiet, I don't think I could do as well. Even at home, when I'm sitting in front of the computer and I'm working on the computer, putting it into the computer, I love it when my little doggies come up and they want a little attention and stuff. It kind of breaks it up. And then I'll go back and I'll go, it actually helped. The noise actually helps me. I don't know why.
Interesting.
Do you do longhand, or do you type it in originally, or how
Most
do you do
of
that?
the time, I do a story in longhand first, and then I go back and type it into the computer, because I'm finding that as I'm putting it into the computer, I'm changing it. I'm altering it, whether it be the scenes or the characters. And then a lot of times that'll help jar my memory, or it will make me want to go and do more research. I'll say, oh, wait a minute, I really should have researched a little bit better. So that's why I like that process.
I like to be out in public with my little tape recorder, not to write, but to observe people, to observe characters. I used to sit at a coffee shop on Rodeo Drive and observe the tourists and the characters, and I would learn things and use things from what I saw. I tend to do it here with a casino. I'll watch people and observe and maybe pick up some of their traits or characters to use.
And now maybe that's what I'm doing. Maybe I'm actually, without realizing that's what I was doing, because I do that. I actually do, I do notice characters, especially here in Las Vegas in the casinos, because I do that sometimes. I'll go into one of their restaurants and I'll sit at a booth or something that's open into the casino.
Yes.
And I think you're right. I think maybe I do get ideas from that.
Yeah.
At least when it comes to the characters.
Instead of taking longhand notes, I carry a little tape recorder and I just talk into my tape. I got in that habit driving the LA freeways because it used to take me an hour to go to work.
That makes
and I'd
sense.
have my tape recorder and I'd be thinking and I'd put those notes down on the tape so that I wasn't wasting the hour driving back and forth.
Well, I use my phone sometimes, but I don't do it so much as to go back to. I found that especially if something's developed from a dream, I actually, by talking about it, even if I just tell someone the story, I remember it. I never forget it again. And I remember the characters. They're very vivid in my mind. So that when I do go back to develop something, it's as if it's just part of me now. So that's the real reason I talk into the phone. I'll record it to the phone. Or I'll just go the next day and tell that story to someone after I've had my dream, for instance. I'm a dreamer. And so I'll wake up 2 or 3 times a week, have a story idea, and then I'll share it with someone so that I don't forget it.
Also, I'll hear a word or a phrase or something that I really like, and I'll put that down because I know somewhere, someday I'm going to use that.
And you probably do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
probably
find
do.
if I don't do that, then I do forget it. If if it's a specific phrase. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I have a book coming up. It's in the process, and as you know, as I told you before, I'm a public health nurse, or spent many years as a public health nurse out in one of the well-known rural areas, and I worked with a lot of madams in the houses of ill repute. So I put that little spice in my next book. So,
Cool.
you never know when you're going to use information.
That's right. Absolutely. Characters come to life that were already alive.
That's right. They're already alive, even though you don't think they are.
Talking about that, I read an interesting book about one of the bordellos, and I learned that a lot of these women are married and have children
Yes,
and
they
go
are.
home and spend time at home and then go back to work.
It's
and
like
I
their
don't know,
job.
that just never dawned on me. I thought they lived there and that was their life. I didn't realize they had an outside life also.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes
They do.
they're
They
flown into the brothel, leaving from here in Las Vegas. I had a good friend about 20 years ago who was an author, and she actually, in between Johns, she had the closet set up with a computer, and she would go in between Johns and work on children's stories.
There you go.
So,
Yeah.
and then she actually wrote a book that there's a lot. I don't know if I want to mention her name right now, but
Don't mention names. No names.
I will just say
No
this:
names.
there was a book written called The Brothel Bible that she also wrote, and that got a lot of people's attention.
Yes.
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 So, I guess the creative process comes from many different sources. It isn't just, it's not necessarily something. There are people who want to write a book. I do know this, and we've talked about this, Joyce, on the air.
Yes.
I know people who've had a PhD and still cannot. They can formulate a sentence, but they can't write a story. The creative process isn't just part of their DNA. So I do believe that even if you have the skill set, it isn't always about the skill set. It is a creativity process as well. It's kind of like what we're talking about, the passion and the purpose. You mentioned two things, Renee. You first of all, you had a passion for writing, but you also, on some of what you wrote, there was a purpose because you were given a purpose.
Absolutely. And I tell my students that you have to be motivated to write. And a great motivation is to put a stack of bills right by your computer
point.
and look at them
Good
every
point.
morning. And that's your motivation
Good
to
point.
get moving.
That's true. And a lot of people do write for money. I would say the majority of authors don't write just for the money. We all dream of, having that million
Right.
seller, and, making the big bucks. But
Of course.
the reality of it is most people realize that will never happen. But I know a few authors who truly set out to write with the idea of making money. And really, there's no fault in that because I find that these people, maybe I haven't heard stories that weren't successful, but the people that I've talked to that set out to write for money have been successful.
And I think you have to find whatever genre works for you.
Right, that's true
I mean,
too.
I wrote a memoir, I wrote an inspirational novel, I've written poetry, and then the last two books now have been crime stories. The next one coming out called Deadly Danger is a true crime story that takes place in Phoenix. But I have found that there's a lot of interest in crime. And so that's why I've kind of concentrated and gone that direction more. Seems like more people are buying crime books.
Well, Morgan St. James has been on the show a lot, and do you know Morgan?
She's my friend.
Yeah.
Yes, I
well,
know.
and Morgan actually chose to write crime because she and her sister started writing the Silver Sisters mystery series together, and they found that was something that was of people's of interest. And then if you know Morgan, she also helps co-write true stories, true crime stories.
Exactly.
So there definitely is a huge interest in true crime. And that is a choice that I think she made, was to go that direction.
I made that choice too. I mean, I write for the Summerlin Writers and Poets blog, and there I write all kinds of things, whatever interests me. I mean, they're short stories, and so I write on whatever subject matter I like, and it's not crime. I mean, it's other things,
I think the one thing I like that Morgan did do with her crime writing is they created funny characters. They did kind of make it a spoof on she and her sister, with the way they did. So that was a little bit unusual, a little bit different.
One of the things that my publisher in New York with Holy Cause Target America, and the next book coming out through them also said to me is, you don't write like a woman. And I said, well, what does that mean?
Is that good or bad?
Yeah, I said, what does that mean? Yeah. And he said, you write violence, very violent. And I said, it's a violent world out there,
That's
you
right.
know?
Yeah.
I mean, to me it is.
Well, question about that. And this deals with the creativity process as well. When you're writing something that is violent, how hard was that for you to do? How difficult was it to get into that mindset? Because you have to get into the mindset of that character and what they would do and how they would carry it out. And I had to write a scene like that in my first novel. And I literally cried because I thought, what are people going to think of me when they read this? Because it was kind of scary. It not only was it gory, it was leading up to, because I made you think that he was going to rape the character, and he wasn't. He just wanted to toy with her and make her think he was going to. He also made her think he was going to let her go, but he wasn't. He always had the intentions of killing her before he left the house. So I just wonder, people say, what is wrong with you? Why would you write such a sick thing? You know what I mean? But how was that for you? How is that process?
I guess it that wasn't as difficult as when someone said to me, "Why don't you write a romance novel?" I struggled and struggled, and I guess
Oh.
I had a lot of problem writing a romance novel. It just wasn't my type of reading. It wasn't something that I had a lot of interest, I guess, with, and so it didn't appeal to me. Where writing about crime or about terrorism, to me, is the world we're living in today.
Right.
It's a scary world, and we need to wake up and know that.
Right. Right. But you didn't find it difficult to write those murder
No.
scenes.
No.
Interesting.
Well, I'm sure you tell your students too, write what you know.
That's right. Right.
But-
what
Yes.
you know and what interests
But
you.
Yes,
Joyce, that's
yes.
my point.
Yes.
There
yes.
are things you don't know. You wouldn't know anything unless you're a murderer. You wouldn't know anything about how to murder someone.
Well, like she says, maybe she's watching people in the casino. She's taking her notes in her tape recorder, and she looks, and maybe her imagination takes over and says, "Is this a mass murderer walking towards the machine and getting ready to put in his dollar before he goes over to his, girlfriend's house, and that's where the murder scene will occur." Maybe she's writing that way as she takes her notes.
And I think it has always interested me to read crime stories and mystery stories, and I like mystery movies, and so I like that idea
like
of
noir.
suspense. Yes,
Noir.
I do. I like film noir.
There you go.
So, in other words, you're saying sometimes we write by osmosis from what we have absorbed.
Good point.
I think we do.
And I know for me, the first one I wrote was a government espionage. I knew nothing about the military. And yet, when I turned it over to an Air Force colonel to tell me, because part of my story is about a retired Air Force colonel, I wanted to find out how accurate I was, and he was blown away.
Oh.
And I'm thinking, where did this come from? Because I've never been in the military, don't even know the first thing about how they really operate. And he said, there are things in there I couldn't even answer that probably could have happened with generals and what they can do. So I think we do learn. And I think, where did this come from? It must have been from something I've read or something I've watched on television.
Exactly. And it's always good to have a sounding board, like you're saying, someone that you can go to. A couple of times regarding weapons, I've had to go and ask people that I know have been in the military or military background and say, is this the right kind of weapon? Am I describing it right? Am I saying it by the right terminology?
That's exactly right. Yes, because you want to make sure your facts are
Exactly.
correct.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good writer.
Yeah.
That's a good writer.
Yeah, one of the things I've learned as well is what you just mentioned, fact checking. When I wrote that first novel, I didn't do any fact checking when I wrote it, and actually even before I put it out. It wasn't until afterwards I went back and started doing fact checking, and I thought, and back then we didn't have the digital age, so
Right.
there was no going back and having it reprinted. But I've learned since then you kind of need to. Not that there was
Yes.
anything wrong with my first novel, because there wasn't. I don't know why I was so accurate. But since then, I have. With anything I write now, I do go and research, and I want to make sure that what I'm saying is plausible, because we live in a technological age where people are going to go and Google it, which they couldn't have done 15, 20 years ago. And they're going to go see, well, is that correct? We've talked about this on another
Yes,
show where
we did.
they filmed a show here at the Sands, the old Sands, when they imploded it. And then a minute later, they're at somewhere else, and they're thinking, that's not even possible. You can't be
That's
at Hoover
exactly
Dam
right.
one minute
Yes.
and at the Sands the
Exactly.
next.
Exactly.
So that's why today you can't get by with as much, because people can fact check.
That's true. They check the facts. The internet is there. People have access to a lot more information. Not necessarily that all of it is 100% correct,
Right.
but the information is out there, and you at least have the sources where you can go and check beyond that. But part of that, to me, also is scary, because our young people are getting information and being programmed in ways that we may not want them to be. I think that's what's happening a lot with terrorism, that a lot of young people are on the internet and they're accessing some of these doctrines and information that really begin to blow their mind, and it's not good.
Well, there's two things I would like to say about it. That actually goes right back to your Smurf book, in that someone's trying to influence you in a way that you're not even aware of. And we saw that with the elections as well in
Exactly.
2016, how and it actually it's gone on beyond, way before 2016, how other countries tried to influence our elections. So we see this all the time. I forgot what the other part of the process I was going to say. I'll think of it in a minute. But, that's an important part of what you're saying, in that, I was going to say, you can't always be certain of what you've looked up on the internet is accurate. We did a show on words.
Oh, yes. We
And
did.
one of the things that happened with that is I wasn't questioned after the show. No one questioned me about what we said on the show. But I had to present my book and do a reading. And it was at that reading that it came up about the show. Someone wanted me to talk about it. And a certain word came up, and I was immediately corrected afterwards that I was not accurate. So then I'm thinking, well, let me go back and do some more research. And as it turned out, I was accurate, but they were as well. In that a certain word came from a 17th century meaning, but changed in the 20th century into meaning something else, and now has reverted back to meaning a good thing. So you can find something and say that can be accurate, and it can be. You just have to look at the timetable to make sure of what was going on at that time.
Yes.
And another thing about that is like we've talked about writing memoirs. If you write something, and then let's say your sister comes along, or your brother, or your mom, or your dad, and they write something similar or about the same topic, they're not always going to be exact because your memory is different than their
Yes.
memory or my memory. The way we perceive things is completely different.
Absolutely. In fact, I tell my students, do not share your work with your spouse, your children, your sister, your brother, because they see it differently.
Yes.
They may not like what you write, and now you're being told derogatory statements, and you become either very defensive about your work, or you go back and you change it.
And Joyce,
That's
you are a
exactly
prime
right.
example of what she
Yes.
just
Yes.
said.
I wrote my first book, which is Lines of Listening, and it is a story, a first-hand account of how I was raised and how my siblings were raised. The same house, the same parents, the same time frame. And I told them I was going to write the book. I read to them before it was published what I was writing, so they knew specifically where they were in the book. And again, I said, I'm going to write this book. They saw it a couple times. They heard me say it multiple times that there was going to be a book written and how intense it was going to be. So then I wrote the book, and it was published. And they got a copy of the book. And everyone was upset. And I said, same time frame, same parents, same household. I don't understand. In the book, I put a foreword that said, this might not be your experience, but it's my experience. It's my understanding. Even with the foreword in the book, and even with an explanation that it was going to be published, I figured I had everything. I also had gone through logistics, and I'd gone through legal to make sure things were taken care of in that respect. I got such a feedback from my family. It was unbelievable. And to this point, my siblings have disowned me.
Yeah.
For writing the book.
Right. And I've actually helped. I helped someone with their memoir, and I think I told you I wanted her daughters to write their version of what it was like for them during this crisis that their mother went through. And it was a completely different take. Completely different.
Exactly.
And that's because as children, they perceive things differently than adults do. And especially if it's coming from a place of hurt, they don't see things the same way at all.
No.
I had a brother who died when I was fairly young, and I remember when a death happens in a family, oftentimes the adults forget about the children because they're trying to console each other, and they think, I lost my son or whatever, and they're forgetting that there's other children there, and they need to be consoled as well, because even if they're as young as 2 and 3. Emotionally, when you see parents going through something and they're crying or whatever's going on, you're thinking, what's wrong with them? Because all they know is hurt.
Exactly.
And so parents often forget about that whole fact. Like, you need to be attending to these kids because they're going to be perceiving this completely different. Not that they lost a brother or a sister or an aunt or an uncle. Like, what is this terrible thing that's happened to my parents? What is this terrible thing going on with my family? They're at a young age trying to figure it all out. So, we all have to try and figure out in life what we're going to do. And as a creative writer, you have to put yourself in all those positions. You have to try and think about what would that character be feeling or thinking about.
The other thing that I like to talk about for a moment is critique groups. I am not a great fan of critique groups. And the reason I am not is that you sit in a group with 6 people and each person gives you their idea of what they think or their input into your story. Now you go home and you make those changes. now you have a homogenized story that no longer represents what it was you wanted to convey.
That's true.
And I think that is wrong. I think that we should stick by what we believe, what we want to write, and the other people perceive it differently.
You're absolutely right. And I learned a tremendous amount of lessons from writing my first book. The passion needs to be there. The creative writing needs to be there. The anticipation of what is the next word for you going to be out of your brain and your mouth needs to be there. The discipline is there, and just do it.
That's right.
And
You're
a purpose.
absolutely right.
And a purpose. I mean,
Yes.
I always write every book with a purpose. And it sounds strange if you write fiction and you write a government espionage, or I wrote a science fiction. But I truly do have a purpose with everything I write.
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
I do too.
I have a direction or some lesson in there I'm trying to teach someone along the way. It may be subliminal, like you were talking about with the Smurfs, but I'm always trying to show that we could have done this differently, or someone could have done it differently, or lived a life a little differently. So I think we do write that way.
The book about terrorism, it's a fiction book, but I wrote it because I want America to realize terrorists come in all shapes, sizes, and forms. They're not just 25-year-old dark-skinned young men. It can be women. It can be middle-aged white men, as we're seeing in recent years. It can be almost anyone.
Right.
Tell us more about that book. I noticed.
Holy Cause Target America is a fiction story about two women. One, a highly successful terrorist that she's a terrorist for hire employed by Iran, and she comes to America to set up cells and cause destruction. She runs headlong into an American businesswoman, and what happens and transpires after that, that's what the story is about, basically.
And that's an interesting take, because what you had just said about women, we always think of men when we think of terrorism, or we think of, because I remember there was that situation that happened in San Diego a few years ago, and the wife was involved.
Exactly.
And I also, I don't know if you ever saw the television series Breaking Bad, but I always thought I would never enjoy a television series like this, because I'm not into drugs. I was never into that much violence. But that hooked me. That writing of that television show really hooked me. And one of the things that, if you paid attention to, one of the villains was a woman from, she was from Germany, and she really was the bad guy.
Yes.
I mean, she had no qualms killing, having someone killed. She didn't want to dirty her hands,
Of course.
but she had no qualms getting someone murdered.
You had to love Bryan Cranston, too.
Oh,
Yes,
absolutely.
yes.
He was so
yeah,
good.
yeah, he was very good.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
So
He had a passion.
Oh, absolutely. He had a passion. And I think you do have to be passionate when it comes to your writing. That's what keeps you enthralled in what you're trying to create. Without that passion, what are you really doing it for? And even the people who say, I'm doing it for the money, I'm not buying that completely.
I don't advocate anybody write for money. Writing books really does not make you money. In the end, you probably are not going to make much money from it. But you write because you feel you have something to say, something you want to share. And I think that's what the important thing is.
Yeah, I do as well. Joyce, did you have anything?
Well, you have another award about the 50 most read authors. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, the Author Talk Show has voted me one of the 50 best authors you should be reading. And people can go online to theauthorshow.com, and they have a vote button, and they can vote for me. And hopefully they will, because it's a really nice honor, and it's something that I would like to achieve. It's very nice.
Yeah. Well, we always like the accolades.
Thank you.
That's right.
Thank
Right.
What else can you give us? Because what is it you teach your students every day when it comes to the creative writing process?
Well, I teach several courses. I teach creative writing, I teach memoirs, I teach novels and short stories, and I teach screenplays. But the creative writing class encompasses everything. We start out with short stories because they are the easiest to do once you learn the format, and they're the one item that you can be the most successful at quickest. You can sell stories to magazines, and you can get stories published in magazines, which gives you credit. You may not make money, but you have a credit, and that helps you go on from there to do other types of writing. Then we teach novels, and I also teach poetry. We go into writing greeting cards, doing documentaries, writing music. Music is very, very similar to poetry. Not writing the actual musical notes, the score, but writing the words is very similar to poetry.
When it comes to script writing, I'm just curious because I did take a series of script writing courses. I'm just curious because there was one exercise I had to do where they had us rewrite the scene 7 times.
Oh my goodness.
And I just want to get your take on that because what was interesting about it is that you think you've written something that's fantastic. Now they're telling you to go back and rewrite that scene. So now you go back and you rewrite the scene and try to imagine a different setting possibly or a different way of interacting with someone. And then by the time you've done it 3 or 4 times, you start to doubt yourself about the first time. And actually, I assume it could probably get much better. It could get a lot better.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Not always.
Maybe.
Not always.
Maybe.
I think the reason they teach you that is the discipline for writing for films, because very often you will have to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. Once you have a producer, he has an idea, the director has an idea. As I said before, your stars will say, I won't say that or I won't do that. So very often you wind up rewriting and rewriting for a motion picture. And I think that they're trying to teach you the discipline of being able to do that.
Not so much the creative part.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you can still go with your creative flow as far as if you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, still go forward with that.
Exactly.
But I like the idea of what you're saying that if you ever have to do that, that's how you can stay attached to a film, for one thing.
Exactly. And I mean, I love writers, but many writers tend to be a little out there, a little flaky. They're not disciplined to be able to produce a particular script at a certain time on a certain date. And those things are important. And you have to be willing to take criticism too, because there's going to be times when you're going to have to change it.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things I've learned probably over the last 30 years is taking criticism. Because when we're authors, we always think we've written the best thing possible.
Of course.
And it is our baby, and it's
Exactly.
close to the heart, and you don't want to hear someone criticize. I know one of the things I read a long time ago was only 1 out of 7 people will even have an interest in what you've written and maybe even like it. So it's kind of like going back to what you had said earlier. You don't want to get a lot of people that are unfamiliar with your work or aren't into that genre to read it because they're going to critique it in a way they don't like it anyway.
Exactly.
You know,
Often, too, the critique groups are other writers, and they all have their own ego.
Their own
they all have their
agenda.
own
Right.
sense of
Yes.
style,
Right.
their own sense of how they think things should be done. And once you incorporate all that, you're losing your sense of
Your
style.
own creativity.
Exactly.
Yes. I have a question about creativity. In a younger writer, someone who may be 20s or 13 or 15, they've been oriented to computers and cell phones and electronic gadgets. How do you tear them away from that and get them to put their sense of creativity down on paper to actually write what's in their brain onto a readable novel or a story? How does that work?
Well, I think you can be as creative using a computer as you would be writing longhand. That I do think you can do. What I see in classes is that with young people, their terrible lack of English skills.
Oh.
They don't have the basic English skills. They're so used to texting everything and abbreviating. They really don't have great English skills.
Right.
And that's a shame, because if you're going to write, it does help if you have some sense of grammar, some sense of English skills, of spelling. All these things are really basics in writing.
Well, the
Do
great thing
you
is,
guide them that way? I'm sorry. Do you guide them that way?
Absolutely.
Or?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
I
Do they
try
have to kind of go back and
Right.
update and then come back to your class?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
And I correct their homework and give it back to them and try to tell them what they're doing wrong. I teach in the outreach program at CSN, so my students are all ages. They're from like 17 to 95, which makes for a really interesting class.
Certainly.
But it makes for interesting sharing because you learn ideas and concepts and why people want to write at different ages.
yeah, I forgot what I was going to say.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I just
As they say, I'm having a senior moment.
that's okay. That's okay. Well, I always wondered about that because so many younger people are creative, like with art or metal or welding or glass blowing, and there's got to be some expressive in the writing form for that same outlet, but they tend to, at least from my observation, be so glued to their cell phones and glued to their iPods. And how do you get that into a writing mode?
That's difficult, to try to teach them to sit down and just let the creative juices flow, to let their imagination flow. And that's something I think that some people tend to do better than others. But the thing I encounter with young people is sometimes they're writing the wrong things, like on Facebook and on Twitter, and this is going to remain with them the rest of their life. They don't realize what they put out there is there for employers to access all their life.
Well, and also it's interesting you'd say that. I just had a conversation with someone today on something that we had just put out an ad for a seminar we're doing, and someone responded in a negative way, not even understanding how the whole thing was formulated, how the people involved got involved. And I'm actually going to do a show on this for another show for the Common Thread, because we do have a tendency to want to react instead of research, and especially on Facebook. Exactly. And I think that we do need to slow it down a little bit, and we do need to think about things. And I think that's a good lesson even when it comes to creative writing. You know, when you're putting something down on paper, think about what you want to say. Think about how it's going to be perceived by someone else. Kind of like my murder scene.
A good point.
Oh my gosh. Well, ladies, I hate to do this, but we're running out of time.
Oh my.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
it
know.
does. It does.
Yeah. So we'd like to thank our guest, Rena Winters, and I'd also like to thank Joyce K. Gatchenberger for being on the show today. And to find out more about our guests, just go to aspectsofwriting.com. There you'll find the links to their information, and also links to our shows where we're broadcast. I also would like to bring up the fact that we are going to be doing a seminar on February 23rd. That's a Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for Aspects of Writing. So just go to aspectsofwriting.com. We'll be talking about the entire writing process, from creating to getting published, and even how to fund your project if you need help with funding. Our show is broadcast every Saturday at 1 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, or Pacific Daylight Time, on AMFM247.com. We also rebroadcast this show on blogtalkradio.com at 9 o'clock p.m. Pacific Daylight Time on Blog Talk. That's 9 o'clock. And to find out more about our show, just go to aspectsofwriting.com. We're on all YouTube. We're on Roku TV. We have various outlets. Just go there and you'll see all the different outlets we're on. That's aspectsofwriting.com. For the seminar, just go to aspectsofwriting.com and click on the events page, and you will see that information there as well. So until next week, this is your host, James Kelly, reminding you, if you can dream it, you can write it. Thank you, ladies, for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
They came to our world seeking new resources. Both Earth and Mars were lush with plant life and mineral deposits. Unlike Mars, however, Earth was alive with a vast array of creatures, not unlike their past world, the one where they had evolved nearly 2 million years ago. It took them over 20,000 years to reach our solar system, and another 20,000 to return home and report their findings. To their dismay, all that remained of their civilization was decaying cities and wandering souls. It would take another 20,000 years to reach Earth with the intent of creating a new oasis. During their time in space, they lost the ability to breathe. Now they had a new mission, not only to settle Earth, but also to create a new life form to house their souls. By the time they had reached our world, only one man's seeds remained for creating a new life form on Earth. From the fruit of his loin, new man was created. In time, it was hoped that one of the species from the various primates they artificially inseminated would evolve to look like them. Theirs was a waiting game. To enter the Earth's atmosphere for a prolonged period of time would cause them to age and die before the transformation from primate to new man was complete. They needed new men to populate the Earth with shells for their souls, but time was running out. Could they intervene and create a new life form from Earth's primates in time to save their souls, and more importantly, Are we at that stage in our history now? Perhaps they already walk among us. The answers lie with Daniel's story of abduction as leaked to the press, the alien transcripts.